Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Wandering Road Podcast. I'm your host Chris, alongside my co-host Dean, and for today's show, we're going to be talking about the Nephilim. How are you doing today, Dean?
Hanging in there, man. How about you?
Not too bad. Ready to get this show started. So the Nephilim, what do you know about the Nephilim, man? Have you ever heard of them before? I know I have through biblical study. You find them in the Old Testament stories, with fallen angels and whatnot. Have you heard of them before?
Yeah, I have heard of them. I don't really know too much in detail about them. I just know that they're, in a way, kind of cryptids. All the stories that we've ever had from them or about them have come from either biblical text or, ancient scripts or something like that. But I do know there's some more modern day examples of them. Before we started the podcast, you were telling me about how there was there's like a biblical explanation, which is from the Old Testament story, which, that kind of stretches into like Judeo-Christianity and stuff. So it's not just the Bible, it's also, the Torah, and presumably also there's stories in the Quran and stuff like that. So maybe we can talk about that perspective first.
When it comes to the Nephilim, they're essentially the spawns of human women and fallen angels. Some interpretations suggest that the Nephilim were a result of a union between fallen angels or fallen divine beings and human women. And these Nephilim, they say, would inherit both human and angelic traits. What those angelic traits are, I can't really say. What we do have from accounts of Nephilim and stories of Nephilim, they're essentially said to be like either really strong or these giant beings. One thing that I could think of is if you think back to the story of David and Goliath, how they always say Goliath was like this massive man that was like, 8 to 10 feet tall.
Mm-hmm.
Some people have made claims that Goliath in that story is actually one of the Nephilim.
So I guess my first question, I don't know if you know the answer to this, but I guess when the angels came down and they mated with human women and created the Nephilim, was there a certain number of Nephilim that were created? I guess it would have had to have been both male and female to continue procreation, to continue the line or whatever. Or does the Bible say anything about there was only X number of Nephilim created?
I can't remember offhand if the Bible actually gives a number, and we're talking about the Old Testament Bible, the Hebrew Bible, that specifically talks about the Nephilim. They call them a race of giants sometimes. So one could assume that there were male and female Nephilim that allowed them to procreate and continue their lineage, one would say.
Mm-hmm.
Because if I think back to, I guess, the Noah story, I may be wrong, but I think one of the reasons that the flood does occur, that God sends the flood, not only are human beings wicked, but it's to wipe out these creatures, these quote unquote Nephilim that plague the planet, if that makes any sense.
Right.
The biblical text provides very limited information on the topic of Nephilim. So that's why when people talk about the Nephilim, you always see these cross references they talk about giants, they talk about the creatures from mythology, different types of mythos across the world. For example, if you look at the Odyssey, how Odysseus encounters an island of giants and he tricks that giant to call him no name, and he blinds him, or nobody. I think it was nobody. And they say, these are the Nephilim that the ancients encountered.
So, I mean, the Odyssey is a story, right? It's not based off of anything factual?
Not necessarily. They say that if you follow the route that Odysseus takes throughout the Odyssey, you'll actually you'll run into places that he actually went to.
Okay.
But for all intents and purposes, it to me, it was a story.
Right.
The only thing that I would take as fact from Homer, well, not necessarily fact, is maybe the story of the Trojan War, because they actually found the city. And like if you follow what Homer says throughout the Iliad, it actually takes you to these different cities and whatnot, the exact path. But as far as the Odyssey goes, I wouldn't say like any of it is based off of something factual.
Right.
But for the people back then, they would have taken it as fact.
Sure. That makes sense.
But I wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts on these creatures and these giants in general? People claim to have found these giant bones throughout the world. There are claims that Native Americans fought them. Like, what do you make of all that?
I think that, so the first thing that jumps to my mind is they must not be as prevalent as one might assume if they were, all over the world before, because I feel like at some point somebody would have come forward and, showed the scientific community or something like that. But then that stands to question the conspiracy theory, like, put the tinfoil hat on. If there's some supernatural or something extra to our reality that someone in power might not want us to experience, then it makes sense that they would try to intercept that and try to keep that from people. However, I feel like, I don't know, it's just always mind-boggling to me to assume that there are so many conspiracies and so many things about this world that are mysterious, like cryptids and aliens and ghosts and whatever. And like, there's always kind of like a little twinge of support for these things that might be in existence. But then if you think about the frequency of which all these occurrences have been happening, it just seems extremely unlikely that there would not be some actual, like, here you go, this is actual definitive proof that you can hold in your hand that a giant exists or existed. And I know we'll get to it eventually. We don't have to go down that path now, but we'll talk about the stories that came out of Afghanistan during the war in the early 2000s about, so that, another case of how some people claim that giants still exist. But the one thing that I wanted to bring up about giants in general, not just the bones, but about their actual size, is that the weight and the height and all that stuff, it's all variable. Because, I mean, the tallest human being that I think we've ever known to have existed, I can't remember his name, but he was like 8 feet tall. You can go to see a likeness of him in the chair that he sat in at like a Ripley's Believe It or Not or whatever, like around the country. Do you know the name of that guy?
Robert Wadlow.
Yes,
and
Wadlow.
Yeah. He died in 1940, and he was 8 foot 11.1 inches tall,
almost 9 feet.
So he was massive.
Okay, I mean, I don't want to. I know you kind of. I wanted to stick to the bone thing first but there's another tangent that I want to go down eventually because it's really interesting, like the Wadlow case and people who have gigantism nowadays. But with the bones,
go for it.
With the bones, just going back to that point real quick. There must have been some kind of discovery in some part of the world that could kind of lean, because we find dinosaur bones all the time, right? And these dinosaur bones are massive. Some of them, 100, or I don't even know how, this is probably wrong, but like 100 plus feet tall, like a brachiosaurus or something. We have like full skeletons for some of them. So lots of bones, lots of huge thigh bones and leg bones and stuff like that, ribs. And even like woolly mammoths were massive. And we actually have found them frozen in the permafrost. And I'm sure science has dissected them and studied them and stuff. So if huge human beings did exist or do exist, like giant, not human beings, but the Nephilim, who are not really human beings, they're mixed. So like that's the other thing too, is human beings have their own genetic structure. So if we did find some kind of bone that supported evidence that giants existed, I feel like there would also be, a scientific white paper out there that talked about the genetic makeup of these human beings, or these beings that are like human or whatever. Just to go down the road of the more modern examples, the one thing that sticks out to me is when I think of someone with gigantism, who is, obviously a full human being, and I don't think Wadlow or anybody who has gigantism has any kind of Nephilim in them or whatever. They're just 100% human being. And the indication for that is they have serious health issues. I mean, I just watched a TikTok video the other day of some massive, I'm just going to assume he was in Africa. It looked like an African environment, but it was an African man. He was massive. He looked like he was easily like 6 foot, 6'11", maybe even 7 foot. But not only was he massive, he was very healthy and muscular. So he was like completely ripped, looked like like some kind of Marvel hero or something like that. When I see guys like that, I think that human beings who like that are the basis for the stories that we get in the Bible. So the story of David and Goliath, when we have stories like that, I imagine that it was, some massive muscular warrior dude who was probably like 6.5 feet to 7 feet tall and really, really, healthy and ripped. You have those outliers in human existence. And then you have the other side of the outlier, the other side of the spectrum, which is really short people. So little people, the smallest person was like a 1.5 feet tall or something like that. And I've seen videos of like the smallest person today or recently, I don't know if they're still alive, but the smallest person today next to one of the biggest people today. And it's such a stark difference. But if you look at it, they both have significant health issues. So I think that if someone were to be born on the larger end and they really were very healthy and strong, then that human being would probably have all kinds of legend and stories associated to them. And over time, I would imagine that would grow into more crazier and crazier stories as humans kind of spin them down the generations and whatnot. And maybe that's how we got stories about Nephilim. But then again, if we are talking about in this reality, if there are Nephilim from the perspective of they are truly half divine or whatever, then I don't know, man, maybe they have some kind of magical ability to where if they die, their bones dissipate immediately, or maybe they can hide themselves. Like some people speculate that Bigfoot is like not just a physical creature, but also like a spiritual creature, has control of keeping itself hidden in another plane of existence or shifting out of phase or something. So who knows? Like you can go down any path. I'm sure there are all kinds of arguments. What do you think about the comparison between if a Nephilim did exist or does exist, it'd have to be supernatural because human beings who are 100% human being who have gigantism or are very large, they tend to have health issues. What do you see a gap or a bridge between the two? What's your perspective on that?
I'm glad you brought that up and asked that question because I hearken back to our last couple of podcasts that we did on the afterlife and religion. And we always came to the same conclusion that it's simplicity. It goes back to the simplicity argument. Because if you are an ancient person, right? Let's say we're both soldiers in ancient Egypt, right? And we're like officers in the Pharaoh's army or generals or something, right? And we're going to go and we're leading an army to go fight the Philistines or something. And we encounter within the Philistine army, like all of us are like, everyone in our army is under 6 foot. Like our tallest warrior is probably 6 foot tall. And then we see one of their commanders is like 7'4" and freaking looks like Andre the Giant. For those of you that are wrestling fans, what possible explanation would someone back then have, not knowing the scientific side of it?
That is such a great point.
This is that this is some sort of deformity that this person has. There's some sort of genetic type of thing that happened to them that made them grow that big. It's not like they wanted to grow that big. They're just probably a normal person. And they're like, well, I don't know how this person got this big because everyone I've seen in my life is between 5 and 6 foot tall. So they're probably some sort of mixture between human beings and some sort of entity. And I think that's the way for people back then to make sense of it, to come up with an answer for it.
I think people lose perspective nowadays on the idea that back in the day in antiquity, like you were talking about the story about, an army seeing a general who's like 7'4" and nobody who's ever been alive in or around their lives, those soldiers' lives, have ever seen anyone too big or very big. We lose perspective nowadays that back then they didn't have news that traveled instantly. They didn't have images, photographs. They just had folklore and paintings, drawings and whatnot, and stories, written words, if they knew how to read, because not everybody knew how to read back then. Lots of people didn't know how to read. So just think about that. That's something interesting we haven't talked about ever in this podcast is a lot of these stories that come from human history. They are very firmly rooted in human history, but so many people tend to forget nowadays that there's a missing scientific and even educational angle to human beings who existed back in the day in which when these stories, came about and whatnot. I think that, that's such an interesting perspective you brought up where, someone who never saw anyone huge in their lives has no way to explain it. And the biggest thing in their lives probably back then for a lot of people was religion. the idea of a single God creating everything and being in control of everything, that's the only thing that's the thing that people fall back onto the most for explaining is religion and divinity, either good side or evil side, light side, dark side, or whatever. That's everything falls back to that perspective for a lot of people back then. So I think maybe that's an explanation for where these stories of giants came from.
Yeah, and it makes sense from that religious perspective as well, because people back then wouldn't understand. They wouldn't have the understanding like we do today in order to understand like why this person is the way that they are. And we're not trying to offend anyone that has, their religious beliefs, because I said multiple times on the podcast, I am Catholic, I'm a Christian, so all I'm doing is just, trying to understand where all of this came from through an analytical perspective. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because clearly we're not seeing them now. If they existed, we're not seeing them now.
Mm-hmm.
And if the story goes, like we said earlier in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, that the fallen angels came down and they, mated with human women. And I asked the question, like, okay, are they trapped somewhere that they can't come about and try to do this again? Or is this something happening covertly that would explain Bigfoot? I mean, that so the interpretations for this are limitless, I think, because I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but apparently the people that subscribe to the ancient alien theory believe that Nephilim are ancient aliens, these giant aliens that came down and had a hand in humanity.
Yeah.
And help building these massive structures.
Oh, yeah, that would help explain, I guess, the ability to lift heavy stuff. But here's something that, man, I'm sorry to be so scientific with this, but it's something that has to be brought up because it really is part of the conversation. You can't just sit here and speculate. If you actually want to like tear down and look at it from different perspectives, you got to think of the angle of reality in terms of how things exist and how we know them to exist around us. But let me first say really quickly, you just brought something up that I learned, or that I remember hearing this years ago, and I didn't think about it till now until you said it. You were talking about Bigfoot and what Bigfoot could possibly be and whatever. But did you know that some people's explanation for Bigfoot is that, I can't remember who it is in the Bible, but there's some human being was granted immortality. Abraham, or I don't know. No, it wasn't Abraham. It was somebody in the Bible who had some kind of immortality or something, or they were able to live forever, or they still exist to this day or something. And some people think that the Bigfoots now are the ancient humans who were granted immortality by divinity or for whatever, or even if it was a curse, I don't even remember or know. But I think that the explanation is Bigfoot is just, they're actually human beings who are really, really old, who are just immortal, but they just grew hair and they live in the forest and like, I don't even know, man. I just thought that was funny and interesting. I'm not saying I believe that, but that's just one of the ways to explain Bigfoot.
Yeah, that's the first time I've heard of that. I've never heard of the immortality aspect. I do know within the Bible itself, you have humans that have lived for not over like 500 years, 600 years. In the book of Genesis, I think it's Genesis 5, the book of generations of Adam, they say that Adam lived for 930 years. But I've never heard of anyone being granted or cursed with immortality. So that's an interesting concept.
Yeah. And you know more about the Bible than I do, so it's possible that I misheard somebody. But just the explanation, it could actually not even be biblical. It just be, I do remember that the angle for that argument was that it was some kind of human being who had immortality. Wherever they got that immortality from, who knows, it could be biblical or not. That's just one of the explanations I remember. It popped into my head after you were talking about Bigfoot. But the more interesting thing that I wanted to talk about is the idea that Nephilim could be aliens. So the first thing, the one thing that I think about immediately when I think about giants and aliens. So, I mean, we do know that different planets exist, and we are becoming better and better as a civilization each year, gathering more and more information about these, like figuring out where these planets are around these celestial bodies and stars way out there in the galaxy. We do know that our galaxy and likely all other galaxies are filled with planets. So that's something that we didn't have confirmed even just like, I think, 40 or 50 years ago, we didn't even know that. That was just speculation. Now we confirm, and we're counting every day like new planets and whatnot. And I think there are ways to do spectral analyses or whatever, if that's what it's called, where you look at a planet and look at the light reflecting off of the planet coming back to you, and you can figure out what the planet is made of and if it has like liquid or water and whatnot. And I can't remember if I think we found planets with water on them. I don't know if it's actually like H2O water. It's some kind of liquid. Do you know anything about that?
I think we have.
Okay.
I think we have found planets with water on them, and planets that are like Earth-like planets that are within that habitable, and they call it the Goldilocks zone.
Yes.
That essentially would provide the perfect conditions for life, or potentially intelligent life. And when we talked about aliens previously, when we touched on the ancient alien concept of how if they did come down and interacted with human beings didn't have the understanding of what they were, and they viewed them as gods.
Right.
So what if let's say let's go out in left field, right? Let's say like the Pleiadians came down and they found human women to be really attractive, and they had kids with them. And these Nephilim are a byproduct of that union.
Mm-hmm.
And then people just refer to them as fallen angels, because if you look at a craft coming down from the sky, like, they wouldn't really understand because they're not human.
Right.
They kind of look human, so maybe they're angels, and maybe they came to interact with us and, intermarry with us. So like you said before, there's so many avenues that we can go down, but the more that you think about it, I know we talked about aliens before, but when it comes to trying to make sense of it, I feel like that kind of makes the most sense.
Mm-hmm. What about the idea
in that aspect?
You'd have to believe, if that were the case though, you'd have to accept the idea that the aliens' genetics are compatible with human beings. And not only that, I don't know if you remember, but I probably didn't do a good job of talking about this, but before in another podcast, but I think it's worth repeating to when we're having a conversation about, aliens coming down who are supposedly giants or whatever and creating Nephilim by intermarrying with human beings. The one thing that is a huge piece of that puzzle is, if you think about how life evolves, and that's something I was going to bring up as well, going off the other planets perspective, like the other planets that are out there. It's possible that I think it's definitely possible that giant creatures can exist and evolve on other planets, because it would have to do with the gravity. It would have to do with the level of whatever they breathe or whatever, like, for instance, oxygen. The reason why we had so many huge creatures millions of years ago on this planet, I don't know if you've ever seen, but like they have there used to be giant centipedes, like multiple feet long, huge armored centipedes. Like, just imagine that, like, you're looking down and you see like a 10-foot centipede that is probably like 1.5 feet wide, just crawling past your leg. You probably wouldn't even be able to lift it because it'd probably be like hundreds of pounds. That's just one example. And giant bugs flying around the size of a frying pan. So the reason why those creatures evolved and existed that size back then because oxygen was so prevalent, so much more prevalent back then than it is today. Over time, as life evolved and the planet shifted, oxygen, I think, became less abundant, or some other factor was a limiting factor, and then creatures and plants and all that stuff started bearing less and smaller fruit. People started, creatures started growing smaller to match that energy level. So if you look at another planet, like, let's say there's a planet out there that's like 10 times the size of Earth, and let's just say, for all intents and purposes, it's covered in water like Earth, and it's got oxygen like Earth, and it looked very much like Earth did millions of years ago. Well, the creatures that are on that planet if the planet is much bigger, it's got way bigger or way more significant gravity than Earth does. So the gravitational aspect would inherently create creatures that are larger to hold themselves up, to be able to withstand the muscles and whatever.
Inherently.
Oh, God damn it. Well, I haven't said it in a while, so I feel like every once in a while is okay. So I got to pull back. No, I'm just kidding. So the creatures that exist on that planet. So it's totally, I'm going off on a tangent, but it's totally feasible. My point is, it's feasible that giant creatures could have evolved on other planets if they were bigger planets or whatever. So the other angle though is, and this is what I was bringing up before about the other podcast, which is how really honestly, how likely is it? I think it's extremely unlikely from a scientific standpoint that an intelligent creature on another planet in another part of the galaxy with a completely different evolutionary line would evolve to look like a human being or have anything remotely resembling ape DNA or human DNA or anything that would be compatible, even closely compatible. Because I mean, this is kind of gross, and this is also interesting because I don't know if you know this, but like Stalin during World War II, or maybe it was right after World War II, I don't remember. He tried to. Soviet scientists tried to mate human beings with primates. Hopefully it failed. But I remember reading about that years ago. It's like, the scientists took ape DNA, which is like 99.3% close to human DNA, and they tried to marry it up with a female human being by artificially inseminating her with ape sperm that may or may not have been, the sperm may or may not have been tweaked or whatever. Thankfully, it failed, but that just goes to show you that even DNA that is 99 point whatever close to human DNA does not link up with human DNA. So if you want to accept the fact that aliens that happen to look like human beings that happen to evolve on another planet came down, it's just the sheer likelihood is so, it's just so unlikely that a creature would come down that's not a human, would happen to be able to mate with a human, but also happen to look like a human. So that's why I always go back to this idea that if aliens exist in the form of a human being or like anthropomorphic with 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 eyes, 2 ears, etc., they or we would have to have both evolved within the same, off of the same line, because you have to assume that science is correct, because we have all this evidence to suggest that with DNA and whatnot, that human beings did descend from primates. So that line, even if you want to argue that line was broken off way sooner, that's what would have to have happened in order for any type of alien to have DNA close enough to ours to mesh up. So what do you think about that argument? Do you think that, I guess it's totally possible that Nephilim could have come, or the giants could have come down and retromorphed our DNA to make us giants? But then you have to be why would they have done that?
But yeah, man, I think you bring up a few good points, especially with the whole notion of the DNA being close. It would be nigh on impossible. It has to be a complete match in order for it to happen. But to subscribe to the side of science fiction, I
just burst everybody's bubble. I'm sorry.
That's okay. But I think that makes sense as well. I mean, it's not like you're completely making that up. It's based off of tangible evidence that we have from what the Soviets tried to do, trying to make these super soldiers, these half ape, half human super soldiers. So that makes complete sense. What I wanted to actually get into next was one of the accounts that we have that came out of Afghanistan during the war in the early 2000s. Are you familiar with that at all?
I've heard it in passing, and I will say just really quickly, I have talked to people directly who were in the military, who heard that story from other people in the military. So it is a real thing that comes out of the military, but go ahead, you tell the story.
So essentially the story goes that there's the Giant of Kandahar. So it's considered a conspiracy theory, but essentially the story goes that a giant humanoid creature was killed by a team of U.S. Special Forces in Kandahar, Afghanistan. And according to this conspiracy theory, the incident occurred during, obviously, the military operations in the early 2000s. So the story says that a Special Forces team encountered a giant creature that was estimated to be 12 to 15 feet tall, with red hair, 6 fingers on each hand, and they claim that, the conspiracy theory claims that the creature was killed in a firefight, and then that the body was taken away by a government agency and never to be seen again. Yeah, so there was this other podcast I was listening to. This episode was released maybe about 3 years ago. It's called the Confessionals podcast. It's one of my favorite podcasts. I was also a guest on there like years ago. But one of the guests, L.A. Marzulli, he talks about the Giant of Kandahar. And essentially he says that the giant like came out of this cave, the special forces soldiers, they were going up to this cave. The giant came out and it had a shield and spear in its hand, and it speared one of the soldiers, killing one of the special forces soldiers. And then the rest of the soldiers just unloaded all of their weapons on it, aiming at its head, and essentially decapitated the thing. And that's how the story goes, that one of the soldiers died in this encounter. They killed it, and then the government took away the body of this giant, supposed giant, covered everything up, and just brushed it under the rug. What are your thoughts on that story, and what did you hear from the folks that you spoke to that were actually boots on the ground out there? Did they actually believe this stuff? Did they ever say they saw stuff, or that they had to keep hush hush?
Well, when I talked to the people, the soldiers and whatnot who were over there, I didn't talk to anybody who experienced this directly. It was always, like, oh, I knew a guy who knew a girl who knew a person, blah blah blah. So this story is prevalent, and people know about it in the military for sure. I'm sure probably half the people who you would ask in the military have heard about it. It's one of those stories that just proliferates very quickly because it's so interesting. So here's the thing, though. That story came out of the war in Afghanistan, which I don't know exactly when that event occurred, but it was probably like, mid 2000s, so like 2005, 2006 or whatever. I think that's when we were like starting to be more active in Afghanistan. We had boots on the ground and soldiers on the ground during the 80s and whatnot. We basically helping the Mujahideen fight the Soviets and whatnot. We worked closely with the Taliban and stuff before, and I just feel like, I guess it's possible that the people who live there, if that was a thing, they probably would have known about it. So that's one thing. So like, if you have people knowing about it, they have stories. Why would science not have picked up on someone telling those stories and just out of curiosity gone to see? Because I'm sure if there was someone who lived in Afghanistan who knew where these creatures lived in the caves or whatever, they could have taken somebody to go up there and at least gotten some kind of footage. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, if there was an engagement where, soldiers died or Marines or whoever, special forces, were killed by a large creature, I really don't think that's something that would have been able to have been kept under wraps for too long, because my question would be, if there was a creature that was non-supernatural, that was huge, what interest would the U.S. government have in protecting such a thing? And I suppose I guess as I'm saying that, I guess I could think of one way, which is, holy shit, we've never seen a human being or a creature this size. We need to study it to make sure like somebody didn't create this thing and there's a massive army of these things. But you said that the story goes that there was like the thing came out of the cave with a shield and some kind of crude weapon, right? So
yeah, it was a spear.
A spear. So
they say.
So the creature then has some kind of intelligence, because unless someone's crafting these these tools for it, then it must be able to craft these things themselves. And then you have to ask, like, where do they get the material to? You know what I mean? Like, it has to get the material from somewhere. Right. Like, how does it craft it? Where did it get the knowledge to craft it? What tools did it have? The tools must still have existed in the cave somewhere. So all that stuff would have been taken by the military and kept under wraps. But for what purpose? I guess, I guess then you'd have to say, oh, the military or the government doesn't want people to know like a truer nature of reality because it would scare people or whatever. But if it really was like a supernatural creature, it seems like it would have been unlikely to have been killed because it's supernatural. It has some kind of but then again, it had crude devices. So I don't know, man. You got to interject on me before I go too wild off down a tangent, because this is like unfolding so many things in my brain right now.
I always wonder why they would cover this type of stuff up. But before I go into that, you did mention the stuff with the Soviet-Afghan war. There were actually accounts from Soviet soldiers that circulated among Soviet soldiers that they had encounters with giants, and that these individuals could single-handedly overpower multiple soldiers and lift heavy objects effortlessly. So it's not just U.S. soldiers that have reported this, or I guess people that have done some digging, maybe whistleblowers that were probably not soldiers, brought these encounters to light. So we do have reports from the Soviets as well saying like, hey, we encountered these things in Afghanistan as well. But, you know, the most logical thing was that these were probably extremely tall and powerful people that were native to Afghanistan that were fighting against the Soviets. So I think that would make the most logical sense. But one thing to note is that we have accounts from both forces.
Okay, that's cool. I didn't know that. But if these creatures or if these things are human beings, the other factor that I wanted to bring up earlier, but this is a good time to bring it up now, is according to physiology. So there are skeletal and muscular limitations for what the human skeleton can handle, and that's based off of bone density and the structural makeup of the most rudimentary parts of our bodies, of human bodies, like actual physical human bodies, because there has to be a limit to what our bodies can withstand and grow into before something starts breaking down. And that's, clear. We clearly see that with people who have gigantism, where they have heart issues, they don't live very long. And even the ones who were healthy, like Andre the Giant, he was healthy in the beginning when he was in his early life. But if you look at him over time, you could see he continued growing and it wasn't very good on his body. And he had a lot of health issues later on, especially with not just his heart, but also with, what do you call it, when you have issues with your joints or whatever. So that's the other thing that I have to wonder about, is if these people, if they were people in Afghanistan who live in caves or whatever, and they're giants fighting and whatnot, they have to have some kind of like procreative route. They have to have some kind of like means to sustain their size, like food and water, like a food and water source. I don't know. Okay, before I go too far, I have to ask you, do you think that if these things were human beings, they're 100% human beings, do you think that it's a lineage, or do you think it's kind of a genetic oopsie? Like did two normal people in Afghanistan have a child and then it just happened to like unlock, some kind of crazy outlying growth spurt that actually worked out to make them healthy, to have the human be a huge creature, or like a human be huge and healthy? Or do you think that it would have to be like a separate line in which you'd have to have two giants making a child to create more human giants, if that makes sense?
I don't think it's a lineage thing. I think it's one of those genetic oopsies. It just happened. I don't think it was like, planned, like, okay, we're going to take this person that has gigantism and have them have kids with this person and set up a giant lineage, because I feel like that's something that would be tracked over time. But I think it's just a matter of genetics.
Okay.
I don't think it's anything supernatural.
Yeah. But if we can go back to...
One thing I did want to bring up again, well, not again, but one thing I wanted to bring up that you mentioned earlier about potential, the government covering it up. My question is, why? Why is there always a cover up? Like, if there are giants that exist on this planet, why cover it up? Are people going to be scared? Like, what is the average person like you or I have to lose from learning about that, from knowing about that, other than expanding our knowledge? I don't think I'm going to be afraid to drive down the street to go fill up my car with gas or anything like that. So I don't understand why there's so much cover up. Or do you think it's like a fear that from the government side that it'll validate the super duper crazies that...
What pops into my head when you bring up that question is, who is this cabal that is controlling information and media and all that stuff? And like you said, why do they care? Like like the average person probably not going to be too affected by such a story. At the same time, I just cannot fathom a scenario. And the only thing I could think about is, okay, let's say the Bible and Judeo-Christianity and all that stuff, which if you accept that all is true, you got to push away Buddhism, you got to push away Hinduism, you got to push away all the animalistic and ancient religions that used to exist way back in the day, even all the way up through Native American, they believe in spiritual animalism or animalistic, whatever it's called. So you have to push all that aside. And even if you just accept that Judeo-Christianity is the one true religion or whatever, or true truth to existence, then whoever's in power would probably have to be on the evil side, right? Because they don't want people to think or know if, crap, this stuff is real. Bible is real. Judeo-Christianity is real. Everyone's going to be judged. There is a one true God who is separate on the other side, who is trying to defeat evil, and evil is trying to win over human beings. So the only thing I could think about is people who are in power, they would have to be on the side of evil from the biblical Judeo-Christian perspective. And like I'm saying, I don't believe that. I'm just saying that if you want to accept the fact that Judeo-Christianity exists and is real and true, which a lot of people in the U.S. are Christian, and all over the world too, obviously it's one of the biggest religions in the world. And if you think about, like, I wonder if Judeo-Christianity, so Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are the three primary Judeo-Christian religions in the world. If you threw all those together, and they would probably vastly outweigh all the other religions in the world. So even like if you want to accept that that's the truth and nature of reality, then whoever is in power keeping the masses away from this information that confirms such a thing, then those individuals would probably have to be on the side of evil from the Judeo-Christian perspective. I don't know, man. Like, that's the only perspective. That's the only reason. I mean, unless you just want to focus exclusively on the fear factor, the fear side of, like, we have to keep people from knowing that there's more to the reality that exists because it's going to destabilize humanity. I guess that's possible as well. What do you see? Do you see anything there to pick apart?
I don't think it would validate any type of belief. I don't know. Because in Islam, they have angels, but they don't have their own desires. So the whole concept from the Judeo-Christian perspective of angels lusting after the daughters of man, that completely goes out the window. So I'm not trying to murky the waters even more, but from the Islamic perspective, yeah, there are angels, but I think they would attribute Nephilim or whatever those things are to potentially being jinn. I may be wrong, but again, that would make it more difficult, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
I feel like we're stuck between a rock and a hard place when it comes to that aspect of it. Because one religion is like, okay, no, these are fallen angels that are sleeping with the daughters of man, and that's where we get all giants from. And then you have another faith, Abrahamic faith, that says, no, angels can't do that because they don't have their own desires. So therefore, Nephilim can't be real. Therefore, they could potentially be jinn. So I think that's where we encounter an issue. I don't know if I answered your question.
No, that was a good explanation. Yeah, man, this has been a great conversation. It has been a difficult one, more difficult than other ones we've talked about, because it's got the interesting factor to it, but it's also got, a lot of limited knowledge and a lot of speculation, and not too many stories and examples in modern day other than that Afghanistan one. What do you think, man, based off of what we talked about and what you know about Nephilim? And let's just assume that the story in Afghanistan is true. Let's just assume that there are human beings who exist and did exist in the past who are like 15 feet tall or whatever, or creatures, I should say, not necessarily human. What's the final word, man? Do you think that these creatures would be purely human, purely alien human hybrid? Are they just human? Are they alien human hybrid? Or is there actually a supernatural perspective with, fallen angels coming down and marrying up with women? And whatever your answer is, what's your final say on why we haven't found any or no explanation or whatever, or why as to if they exist or not?
So I'll answer in two ways. One, from the supernatural perspective, just because it's fun. It'd be interesting if they were, hybrids of fallen angels and human women.
Yeah.
That would be an interesting concept if that turned out to be true, because that would validate so many religious texts and beliefs, and that would throw a monkey wrench into the whole religious discussion that we would have to have around the world of like what's valid and what's real and what isn't. But from the scientific perspective, I think just because there have been different species of hominids that lived alongside Homo sapiens, humans, for thousands and thousands of years. And I think even in Indonesia, they found, I'm going to butcher this name, the Homo floresiensis.
Yes, I remember hearing about that.
Floresiensis. Yeah. For layman's terms, if you ever watch Lord of the Rings, they call them real life hobbits that existed at one point in time. So if there were these quote unquote hobbit-sized human beings or humanoids or humans, whatever you want to call them, that existed, there's always a possibility that there was a race of hominid giants that existed. And I think that would be the scientific logical explanation. There are Native American stories of Native American tribes battling these giants. And they describe them as being like 7, 8, 10 feet tall, having red hair. Apparently I think it's out in the Midwest or the deserts of Arizona or something like that. They found these giant bones in caves that match the Native American stories.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what happened to those bones. They might have been confiscated or something like that for a cover-up. But I think on the supernatural side, I think it would be interesting to say that, hey, they're a mixture of humans and fallen angels. But my analytical, my scientific side will have to say the fact, based off of the discovery of the quote-unquote hobbits on that Indonesian island, the skeletons of those hobbits, there's always a possibility that there was a group of giants as well.
Yeah.
That we probably killed off, because what did we do to all the other different species of humans that lived alongside us? We either killed them or we interbred them out of existence. Mm-hmm. What do you think?
I think that's a good angle too to talk about the quote unquote hobbits in Indonesia. I do remember hearing about that story years ago where they discovered tools and stuff like that of these very small human beings. It's presumable that non-humans who branched off or were precursor or pre-creatures to humans or whatever, there could have been giants that existed. And I think about the perspective of the primate perspective, which I always found fascinating, the Gigantopithecus africanus, which is the largest primate. I think it's a primate, the largest primate known to humans. You know about that?
Yes, I've heard of that. Yes, I've heard
so
of that.
Gigantopithecus was essentially just like, I don't even know how tall it was, but if you can look it up online, like Google Gigantopithecus or giant ape or whatever, if you're listening and you're curious, you can see somebody created like an actual like model of what one would look like up next to, or like just in life, in real life. And there's someone standing next to it, a guy standing next to it. He looks like a tiny child next to this gigantic ape. So if this ape could have existed and it could have sustained itself in a healthy way, it could have found enough food to sustain its size and et cetera, and all the water, whatever. I think it's totally possible that comparatively a human being, and like we talked about the extremes earlier, with nowadays we have gigantism, we have dwarfism, or whatever the proper term is nowadays. If that can exist on the human spectrum, I think it's safe to assume that you could also see that the evolutionary perspective of how some creature or some or humanoid primate or whatever could have turned into a giant that could still be around today. So I will say that I am still skeptical on whether or not such creatures exist today, but I think that if they did exist, I would have to argue that there wouldn't be any gain for the people in power to cover it up, because it would be purely scientific that would only aid in supporting evolution or whatever. So I guess if there was a cover up, it would have to include, there'd have to be an angle of like either aliens or supernatural or something, not just purely human.
Thanks for tuning into today's episode of The Wandering Road. You can find us on Apple, Google, Spotify, and most podcast platforms. Be sure to subscribe and share. Also, don't forget to give a follow on Instagram at twroadpodcast and follow my TikTok at twrpodcast. Take care, and I'll catch you on the next one.